Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we have with us Edward Cadman, whose poetry has been a source of spiritual direction and meditative contemplation. Raised in Wenatchee, Washington, Edward had spent years hiking the trails of the North Cascades from Lake Chelan to Snoqualmie Pass. Poetry has always accompanied him on his travels in the mountains. Deeply influenced by the work of Gary Snyder and Theodore Retke, Edward's writing has been developed in his many travel journals as a record of his merging with and befriending solitude. Since 1979, formal Zen Buddhist practice has steadily unfolded in Edward's life, deeply influenced by his poetic mentors and his wilderness adventures. To his closest friends, Edward is known by his Dharma name of Swami Pranesh. After a long career as a teacher of literature and a student of Zen, poetry has become one key technique for Pranesh to use in illuminating his inner journey into old age and death. And as an old friend of yours, Pranesh, I'm going to introduce you as Pranesh Cadman. Welcome to our show.
Well, thank you, Sheila. I'm honored to be asked to talk to you on radio like this, and I'm really happy to hear your voice.
Well, thank you. With very fond memories of the time I met you, as I described it many moons ago, in a University of Washington extension or free university kind of summer writing workshop led by a recent graduate of that program at that time. Michael McGee had graduated with a master's in creative writing, and he was teaching a group of us, often outside, as I remember, under a big tree, and we would sit and we would learn about writing poetry, and we would bring our poems in the next week for workshopping. It was my very first workshop experience. Was it your first too or not?
I think it probably was.
So there we were, newbies among newbies, I guess, writing.
Yeah.
One of the things that I also remember is that you told the group you enjoyed getting postcards, and I took that very seriously, and I think I went to Eastern Washington later that summer and sent you a postcard from there. Do you remember that?
I do. I think it was Sun Valley, Sheila.
Sun Valley. Well, thank you. You might have a better memory than I do. Somewhere east, right? And I took it very seriously, and I thought about the postcard and what I would write on it. Next thing I know, years and years later, I get a communication from you. And you had read a poem that I had published in a journal of writing by teachers in Washington, and your note said, "Sheila, is that you? Edward Cadman." And I was excited to have that connection again. And you were, at that time, teaching middle school, I think, in Roslyn, Washington.
Right.
And that was exciting to learn. And then you invited me to come and be a visiting poet in your classes, which was also exciting. So there we were, back together around poetry. I learned that you were very interested in having your students write. And let's start our talk off today with some of your memories about why it was you were teaching middle school children to write poetry.
I love poetry. I studied poetry in college. I majored in lyric and reflective poetry. So I lived and breathed poetry. Therefore, as a teacher, I wanted to introduce students to poetry. And at a small school like the Roslyn Middle School, it's called Walter Strom Middle School, I just felt that the 7th and 8th graders could use a good dollop of extra work with poetry or play. And I was given like a small stipend, like $100 or something, to have a special enrichment day. And that's why I contacted you.
I hope I added to the special enrichment.
You did. And Sheila, I have a poem that I wrote from that day that you were here. Maybe it's a nice way to start. So you gave us this exercise of, I call myself something, to kind of get the kids into merging with another object or person. And so I have this one that I did in the class called, I call myself a trail, because I like to hike, and I had hiked all my life. And so hiking was sort of the first thing that came to mind for your exercise. So here we go. I call myself a trail. Nobody knows how I love to hear your pounding paces coming my way. Nobody knows how soft the pine needles land as the wind showers them down. How pungent the manzanita, how rich the lupin perfume, how secret the orchid's secrets. I call myself a trail, high in the mountains. Nobody sees when I'm lost in the mist.
Lovely. And you wrote that right then in class?
Yeah.
So I hope that you shared it with your students at the time?
I think we did, yeah.
I would think you did. So you mentioned that you majored in lyric and reflective poetry?
Right.
I've never heard of a major like that, and I find that lovely. But you did not write as an undergraduate?
There were no opportunities to have creative writing classes. I went to Princeton University, graduated in the class of 1968. Princeton was pretty focused on just academic understanding of certain traditions without really getting to practice them, per se.
So you held all this poetry with you and added to it, I'm sure you continued to read poetry. And I'm trying to remember when that summer was that it was your first workshop too. Was that a beginning for you then?
That was in the late 70s, I think, because I had already had a couple teaching jobs and I had done a lot of traveling and had come back. Just wanted a summer opportunity before I started my next teaching job, and that's how I found that class.
So you were ready to write
Yes.
in the late 70s. That's
Well,
wonderful.
I had done a lot of writing all along, and that was journal writing.
Mm-hmm.
So in my travels, I had been teaching in Australia. I had traveled throughout Asia, India, Europe, and I had kept a pretty much daily journal of my adventures. And then I had also adopted the same technique in hiking. So I would carry a journal with me and just very in-depth writing of what I did day by day.
Did you go into your journals to create some of the poems?
Yes, I did. Let me give you an example
Sure.
of one, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And this is also one that's very much influenced by Gary Snyder, his leadership in writing about being in nature. And this one's called To Starlight, and it's taken from one of my journals. To Starlight. All afternoon I descend to it, steadily downhill from larch zone to fir zone. Dusty, rocky switchbacks, lowland manzanita, autumn leaves on the trail. To valley bottom, huge cedars. To sandy beach and boulder shaded by a pine. To cooking dinner by candlelight. To starlight, floating at last on Donkey Lake.
Brings us right to that kind of hike. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now we know it from the persona of the trail's point of view and also from the hikers. Thank you for being so observant and bringing all of the detail to us. So somewhere along the line, you began writing in tune with your Zen practice in a very particular mode. Would you tell us more about that?
Well, sure. In 2002, I started practicing Zen in Seattle with a group who was led by Genki Takabayashi. And Genki was a Japanese citizen who had come to America to lead this group in Seattle. He represented a kind of Zen called Rinzai Zen. If you know anything about Zen, there's a school of Zen called Rinzai and a school called Soto. And in the Rinzai tradition, we would have week-long retreats where we would go doing meditation, having meals, walking meditation, working, basically in silence. And we would have little interviews with him once or twice a day. And at the end, there was a beautiful ceremony where he kind of closed the energy by standing at the altar with a stick of incense and doing 3 circles, huge circles with his arm. And at the end of the 3 circles, he would read a poem. And the poem is called an incense poem. Let me read you one of his poems. Remember that he was Japanese, spoke English very simply. Summer clouds rush past the peak of Dai Sesshin. Sit, 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 sit. Just now Samadhi. Who knows the no gate or four gate open mind? Over your feet blows this morning's Zen breeze. Let me read you another one real quick.
Okay,
every sesshin.
Did he write them the same day as he was reading them to you?
Yes. It was sort of like a summing up for the teacher as well as for the students to be presented with this summary.
I see.
So that was a summer sesshin. The word sesshin is the Zen name for a retreat. And here's one for autumn sesshin 2001. Closing incense poem. Light and dark, life and death, spring and autumn, never one without the other. How then do we find oneness? The garden turned over and put to bed, hedges trimmed, walkway repaired, coffee cake baked.
That sounds yummy.
He would also write a poem for every anniversary in his personal life. And so maybe I'll read one more from his personal life. This is the poem he wrote on his 74th birthday. So that was February 21st, 2007. The name that he calls himself is Muho. It starts in Muho's garden. By now, he had retired from our group and had moved to Montana and lived on a little 2 or 3 acre rural farm. So here's the poem. In Muho's garden, high pine tree, a bird is playing. Gentle wind, where going? Passing cloud, running water. Genki Zen is nothing doing, making tea. He drinks the universe.
Lovely.
You get the idea of what these poems do.
Absolutely. And are they always dated? I think is something to that. Is there part of
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when you read them as a collective, it's just nice to be tracking the time, the differences, the seasons.
Yes. And,
Yeah.
and every newsletter that was put out, we usually was time for a newsletter after the session, so maybe 4 a year. Each one had the incense poem printed in it, and that's where I've kept all those newsletters, so that's where I'm getting these.
Well, that's wonderful.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend. In case you just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, Sheila is talking with Seattle Zen practitioner Pranesh Cadman, formerly Edward Cadman, about his practice of writing incense poems.
Would you like to talk about why they're called, I think it's obvious, but it would be nice to hear you say it. Why are they called incense poems?
Yeah, oh, great. Well, the incense was used at the end. The 3 circles, I believe, are representing the 3 treasures of Buddhism, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So the Buddha is the teacher, the Dharma is the teaching of the teacher, the Sangha is the community receiving the teaching. And the incense pervades the room with its smell and its smoke. And it's a connector with the people sitting there, the Sangha. So we had this connecting poem, we had this ending poem. Also, Sheila, during the service, sometimes people would be ordained, and they'd be given a special name. And that name would have, like in my case, my name means great energy. Another person's name is fast cloud. These all have connotations when you think about them in Zen. And so in the incense poem, we would also incorporate the name people had received, 2 or 3 people each time. it was a complex undertaking to sound so simple.
Right. So when did you begin writing them yourself?
Well, it was when I met you, I think. After you and your husband had moved to Port Townsend,
Uh-huh.
I was kind of interested in just telling you about this wonderful form that I had discovered. So that's really what would inspire me to write them, was to see you.
Well, thank you. So telling me about them made you realize that you could write them too?
Yeah. I have a couple here that I wrote on visit to Port Townsend to stay with you. Would you like me to read one of them?
Oh, I'd like you to read a couple of them. I think the people listening from Port Townsend would be overjoyed.
This one is called Weeds. Remember weeds?
I remember weeds all the time. I walk on the weeds. Yeah.
I don't know if everybody knows that you have a big veggie garden and you're always at work. Seems like every day of the year in your garden. And we would talk about your garden a lot and visit it. I would photograph you there. And I had also a lot of experience working in a big truck farm when I was younger. So anyway, this is weeds, and I think we had a discussion about pulling weeds, and this is what came to me, and it goes like this. When you sleep, you dream of weeds, shapes, root systems, textures, fragrances. Cuddled with your husband and your cat, you cough and dream in your sleep. Perhaps it's weed pollen tickling your throat and your cerebellum. Just outside, while you sleep, birds coo in the night. And down at the beach, ripples of whale splash slip onto the rocky shore. Wake to cedars soaking sunlight, a moment to hold while the others sleep. Who is she now who remembers her dreams? Morning coffee on the deck, you say, the weeding looks good. Sunlight shines strong in your garden, on your husband and you. Your old cat stalks his territory among the weeds.
Thank you. It makes me smile and think of summer, for one thing. I do remember telling you that if I've been weeding all day and I close my eyes to go to sleep, for a while all I see are the different weeds, just one image after another after another. And look what you did with that. Thank you. Now, so
yeah, that was because of our conversation.
Yeah.
And I think I was up early and I could hear you coughing, I think.
I guess so.
I put that in.
You might have. Somehow you saw my husband and the cat, too. I don't know if you can come back. The incense poem, then, doesn't really have to be short. It seems like there's maybe something else to it, too.
The thing that I liked, that I picked up from it, Sheila, was rhetorical question. Who now hears the wind? Or, in this one, who is she now who remembers her dreams?
Right, so inserting that kind of question, not necessarily at the opening, but somewhere.
Right.
Yeah, lovely. Did you say you had a second one, and would you like to read it?
Yeah. This one's also from the trip to visit you, and we had gone on a walk together with one of your friends, maybe some other people too. It's called Visitors to Cape George. Stranger meets friends meet stranger. One amazed Nick thinks, you have pretty teeth. You hide well your well of grief. Where are we coming from? Chattering down the path of backlit brambles, unite us, detritus, in rambling stories, cedar fronds and blood blisters. Oh, followers of the way, how can we embrace despair? After a dinner made from the vegetables of our garden, let us ferry to the compost our cynicism, our mourning, and all the peelings from the Brussels sprouts.
I love it. I love the use of composting our despair, bringing us back with the peelings of the Brussels sprouts. So you're very attentive. I mean, one of the things the incense poems require, it seems, is to be very attentive to the two questions in that poem and very attentive to how those questions arise out of the moment that you're experiencing.
Yes. Also, the rhetorical question softens the judgment that one is making by looking at other people and wondering what they're like and judging a stranger.
Right, it brings it back to the observer, the viewer.
Yeah, and how we're interrelated through the question.
Right, so that sense, too, of the community receiving the poem.
Yeah.
We don't have too much longer to talk, but you are a person who writes well and seemingly easily and often, and yet publication is not what you require to maintain your interest in being a poet. So can you address a little bit about that?
Sure. I primarily like to photograph. Photography is how I spend my creative time. I like to take photos every day and then look at them and edit and crop them. And occasionally I will then make a project that involves writing the poems. And that is usually just to make a book of the poems with commentary to give to someone. It would be fun, I suppose, to see my poems somehow printed up, but the main thing is just having projects to work on.
So you combine poetry with your photography, with your connecting to others personally in a greater community of your friends, and that is where the pleasure is for you.
Yes.
Yeah,
then I give them the book.
That is lovely, because those of us who publish in literary journals here and there, and even our books, don't necessarily connect with the people for whom our poems have made a difference, or the people for whom our poems are written, or from experience with them. So poetry as a way of life seems very ingrained in what you're doing, even if your primary focus is photography. And I just admire that so much, because you do it for the pleasure, you do it for the connection, you do it as part of your Zen practice, and what really could be better?
Right.
Yeah. I can't imagine it, really. I mean, those of us who have to spend time, which I do, will I send this poem out? Will it be rejected? Will it be accepted? But do you worry that the people that you give it to will not like it?
No, because I give them to kids.
Oh.
Mostly.
Uh-huh. And they appreciate it.
Yeah, I think so.
And you're turning them on to reflective and lyric poetry without...
Yeah, and including them in my wanderings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you're a wonderful trail. I love that persona poem. I'm a little shy about hearing your perceptions of our house and the gardening, but it brings it all to life, and it seems to all make it matter more. So I want to thank you for that. And before we end, I wonder if you do maybe have another one or two poems to read.
What I've gotten into mostly now, Sheila, when I do a poetry for myself, is to accompany a photograph. So I have been given a beautiful empty book, just the size for a vertical 4x6 photograph. And now I write acrostic poems only in this. So I will take the subject of the photograph and then make that the vertical title and also demark the stanza.
So you mean that every line starts with the next letter of the word?
Of the title,
of the title. Okay.
So here's a kind of Zen one and a hiking one. I hope you like it. It's called East of Millam Pass. And the photograph is on one of my trips where I photographed Millam Pass, which is in the Anahuac Mountains, just near Lake Chelan in eastern Washington. The photograph shows a lone large tree, a blue sky, and long, long descending boulder fields coming off from the ridges. So east of Millam Pass, it has 4 stanzas. Entering and imagining secret Arhat Buddhas trekked here too. Outward bound, forest found of larch. Nilam sanctuary, inside cascades. Love, heart, ambulation, momentarily eternal. Passed the summit and set up camp. Sat in robes, silent with the rock slides.
Thank you. Pranesh, I think that's all we have time for. So we're going to have to end. I hope we have another conversation. I'm a little leery of having you visit us again, but I can't wait to receive a poem. So thank you very much for this time.
Well, thank you, Sheila. And I'm deeply honored that you would consider having me on your program. Thank you.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.